We wanted to take an opportunity to have a little bit of a worship time today, even though we were prevented from doing so because of the events that occurred yesterday and the police presence that has been in our area for quite some time. And we wanted to talk together about our experience of faith and belief and how to manage the terrible things that have occurred now for the first time right in our own neighborhood. At least the nature of this particular event. So I want to begin by sharing a story with you and leading into what our gospel text, which is, as it turns out, surprisingly appropriate for what it is we're going through right now, has to do with doubting Thomas and how we are people who from time to time succumb to doubts. And though Thomas has oftentimes been looked down upon by the church, and though we have our own doubts, we try not to associate too much with him and don't recognize who he was and all the things he did for the church. But now it's so very important to recognize our humanity and to celebrate who Thomas was for the church and as a disciple and as part of a community. And I want to begin by sharing a story with you and then reading the gospel text that is assigned for this particular Sunday. The story I wanted to share had to do with how things are perceived differently in different places. When my family and I lived in Africa and then subsequently in Thailand, in order to insure a car, there are a variety of safety procedures and precautions and procedures that you have to go through in order to get insurance for your car. In Africa, for example, there were 8 separate safety things that you had to have in order to get legal insurance for your car, because there was so much car theft and the roads were so bad and so much damage that they just wouldn't insure you unless you had all this stuff. And it included things like an elevated exhaust pipe. It included locking mechanisms of different sorts on all over the place. And so you become a little bit, not paranoid, but a little bit nervous and careful about how things were. Now that was so very different from the context in which I grew up. Where I grew up, we often lived in almost rural environments, and people would leave their homes open at night. They didn't even lock their houses. And it became more and more tense the more that we lived in urban environments. But the fact of the matter is that people were much, much laid back. And I don't know that my dad ever locked his car. I honestly don't know that he ever did. But now, not only do I lock my car, but I've got one of those bars for the steering wheel in case I'm going into some shady place. I lock it down really good. And
That's my house.
Yeah, don't go to Pastor Tim's house.
Need a lock.
Anyway, after we were in Africa and in Thailand, we moved back to the States. We had the privilege of living in a small town in North Dakota. And I swear to you, that was so much like going back 40, 50 years to when I was a kid, where everything was just relaxed. People didn't lock their homes. They didn't worry about anything. And one of the traditions that existed there for me was every morning I would go and have coffee with the parishioners, the men, the farmers, at the local restaurant. They'd sit around at 7 to 8:30 in the morning having coffee. And the only reason 8:30 is because that's when the mail was put out. And so when the mail was put out, we'd all go to the post office and get our mail.
There you go.
So we'd have our coffee and sitting there. And one day, I got back to the office, to the church, and I realized I'd forgotten my phone. Now this is particularly problematic because it was one of the new iPhones. I don't remember which one it was, but I didn't have permission to buy it, and I was kind of in the doghouse for having done so. And I thought, oh my Lord, I've lost the phone. And I knew for sure it was gone forever, and I was just so sad. So I went back to the restaurant to see by any chance if someone had recovered it. And before I even had the door open, the lady at the cashier said, "Pastor, you forgot your phone." And it just surprised me how very different things were, and how sometimes it becomes difficult for us to believe that things can change. Yesterday for me was such a day when, in this particular city, in this context, Poway has been a place that has been remarkably peaceful. There have been incidences, to be sure. You remember the young girl that was murdered some years ago. But generally speaking, institutional violence has been something that we've not seen, and something that we've tried to prepare ourselves for, and something we've been concerned about, but not something that we've ever had to really face. And yesterday we had such a busy day on campus. Pastor Tim was officiating a funeral, a memorial service in the sanctuary. I was at a support group that was meeting in the little building over there, the name of which I don't even know, the former office, I guess.
You had a reception going on?
The reception was going on for the funeral in the parish hall. Becky Steller was running the children's choir rehearsal and so forth. And all this was going on late morning yesterday. And as we were coming up to the meeting, all of a sudden it's pop, 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 pop. And it was scary. And I didn't even really think about it that much. And we had a visitor come to visit us in the office here, and he said, I just saw a couple of old people running with a couple of little girls, and like they were taking them somewhere. And all they kept saying was, call the police, call the police. Clearly something very bad was going on. And as we experienced all of this and began to realize what was happening, and the helicopter began to fly overhead announcing the missing children and that there was somebody that was being looked for having perpetrated this terrible act, it was clear that things were very different.
And we didn't know where that person was.
And we didn't know anything. We didn't know if the person was going from the synagogue to the church
to here.
We didn't know. We just didn't know. And so it seems to me that in moments like that, you begin to have some lingering doubts about where God is in all this. And I know that the text that has been appointed for the second Sunday of Easter, which is today, which we would have celebrated had we had permission to come in for our worship time, is from the Gospel of John, and is the famous text that has to do with Thomas, who's sometimes called Doubting Thomas. And I'm going to read that for you and let Deacon Mindy share some thoughts with you that she prepared for what we had hoped would be our regular worship service. This is from the Gospel of John, reading from the 20th chapter, and I'm reading from the Common English Bible, beginning at the 19th verse, 19 to 31. It was still the first day of the week. That evening, while the disciples were behind closed doors because they were fearful of the authorities, Jesus came and stood among them. He said, "Peace be with you." After he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. When the disciples saw the Lord, they were filled with joy. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." Then he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you don't forgive them, they aren't forgiven." Thomas, the one called Didymus, one of the 12, wasn't with the disciples when Jesus came. The other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he replied, "Unless I see the nail mark in his hands, put my finger in the wounds left by the nails, and put my hand into his side, I won't believe." Now after 8 days, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Even though the doors were locked, Jesus entered and stood among them. He said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. Look at my hands. Put your hand into my side. No more disbelief. Believe." Thomas responded to Jesus, "My Lord and my God." Jesus replied, "Do you believe because you see me? Happy are those who don't see and yet believe." Then Jesus did many other miraculous signs in his disciples' presence, signs that aren't recorded in this scroll. But these things are written down so that you will believe that Jesus is the Christ, God's Son, and that believing, you will have life in his name.
Thank you. So, as Pastor Luther mentioned, yesterday was one of those days that I think changed things for us. And when I say that, I'm actually a little bit hopeful in a way that things will change because of this. When we get up in the morning and we start going about our business and something throws us off, we strive to get back to normal because we want to be back to normal. And I don't think normal is good enough anymore. And that is one of those things that, when these incidences happen and they're on the other coast or they're in the Midwest and we get right back to normal. and maybe we remember what happened, but it doesn't impact us the way that this will. So when I was rethinking my preparation for a sermon this week, I've been thinking about Thomas and how Thomas was the one who, he has the guts to stand up and say, yeah, I don't believe this. I don't believe what you all are telling me. I'm doubting it, and until I can see it for myself, I'm not in. But then consider what his community did. The disciples did not push him out or tell him to, take a hike. 8 days later, Thomas was right there in that room, and Jesus presented himself. And Thomas declares that Jesus is God. And Thomas has this stigma now of being the doubter, but then think of everything Thomas did after his witness to Christ. He started the churches in India. His witness to Christ overcame doubts probably all of his life, even as he was building the church in India, and he was having difficulties there. So I think if we kind of look at how that community rallied around one another during a very difficult time, when people start having doubts, I think that's one of the things that our community is called to. And I'm not just talking about incarnation, definitely incarnation, but also the greater community. I think it's really important that we remember that doubts aren't the bad thing. Silence is what can really deter faith. And if we're not willing to talk about what we doubt, if we're not willing to talk about what we're afraid of or what questions we have, if we're not willing to just have dialogue with people of other religions or other beliefs or no belief, that's where we get stuck. And that's where we can't support one another in community. And I know for myself, I needed to be someplace last night, so I was at RBCPC because I couldn't sit home by myself, and Pastor Tim was there, and there were a number of people there, and it just felt good to be with people. It didn't matter that there were Jewish people and Muslim people and different denominations of Christianity. We all came together last night to say that this has to stop, and that love has to conquer what's going on. And so just kind of to tie it all together, it's like for Thomas, obviously the disciples loved him enough to bring him in even though he doubted, and support his times of just not knowing and questioning. And
he just wasn't feeling it.
Yeah. And I know from confirmation, Betty and I did an exercise with our confirmation class, and we had parents and students list out what their doubts were and what questions they have and why it's hard to believe. And those are just discussions that I encourage all of you to have in your families or within the church or in your neighborhoods. So if the two of you want to chime in.
My comment would, I felt a lot like Deacon Mindy last night, where, I didn't want to be alone. And when I heard the words, I think Pastor Luther sent me the text about the vigil, that became very, very important to me to be at. And then while Deacon Mindy and a bunch of us were sitting, there was quite a bit of diversity in there. We saw Muslim people, Jewish people, Christian people, but it was so cool that they made it very clear, saying love is what we're all about. Love is the central message of all those groups. And it's a little sad that it takes a terrible tragedy like yesterday to bring us together, but it did. And it brought together and showed us that we are a bigger community. People of faith are a bigger community than we realize. Yeah, we have our differences and we go our different ways. We have our different traditions. But it was love that when we came together, we made sure we said love conquers. And that really, really helped me last night, because yesterday things are happening so fast. It sounds weird, but we had a powerful funeral. We celebrated an amazing man, and the family demanded that we would finish with the song "Lift High the Cross," and that was wonderful. For me, that's like the greatest song of proclamation there is. We finished with that. Some of the people were going off to the reception. Some of the people are still in the sanctuary. And then the tragedy occurred, and every one of us and our wonderful staff, Becky and many of our other and volunteers, we had to act fast because we didn't know what was going on. Safety was the most important thing, and we didn't exactly know what was going on. So we were putting people back where they needed to be, and all of us were on heightened alert all through the day. Making sure people are going home safe, the children are going to the right places they needed to be. All the time we're walking around, and we're seeing people with AR-15s just walking around. This is not normal.
But they were sheriffs.
They were sheriffs. They were
just saying.
The good guys. And we're thankful for that. But for us, and like was said before, this is not normal. And we did get everybody out safely, and everybody went the right way. And soon, the three of us were just sitting, and we were talking earlier how the campus went from this busy, wonderful place of activities and learning and counseling and celebrating life, and suddenly it was quiet. And it felt very strange, because this is a place where love is shared, love is learned, relationships are built. Well, after the vigil, and that's when you're alone, and that's when I was alone, last night was hard. I went down and I went home by myself, of course, and Brewski did his best to cheer me up, does his very best. Mm-hmm. But when I finally put my head on the pillow, it kind of hit me about what happened. A beautiful member of our neighborhood was murdered. Rabbi, who's a good friend of Pastor Luther and Mindy and has done things for our kids, was injured. It started to hit me. I felt very alone, but then I knew I was part of community. And I think Deacon Mindy put this really well. I could not wait to get back with our community. I needed to get back, and I was actually going, I'm so glad tomorrow is Sunday where we're going to worship together. I'm not going to have to wait a bunch of days to worship together. And I slept, after I realized that I slept well, I woke up this morning and I couldn't wait to get back to our community. I couldn't wait to get back to worship together, to hear the promise of our baptism, to hear the promise of forgiveness, and the news that we are a community that is defined by our identity as children of God. And that, I think, turns us to where we are in Easter. And I think my heart went back to that song, Lift High the Cross. And I needed to get to be with community surrounded by that cross. Or we surround, where the cross is the center of who we are. And this morning I was very disappointed that authorities wouldn't let us in. But my biggest desire was to be with everybody in community and worshiping together. And now this time, this is actually very healing for me. And I'm so glad you're watching. And that again also is healing and comforting for me.
I think that the last thing that I'd like to say is to suggest that for those of us who are members of the Christian faith, and as Pastor Tim has said, this is significant for members of all traditions, whether Judeo-Christian or Eastern traditions, whatever the case may be. But love undergirds all traditions. And for us, the paradigmatic expression of love is the Easter event. The very thing that Thomas was having a hard time wrapping his arms around. Jesus has come back? Jesus is alive? I don't think so. Unless you show me, I don't believe it. And so this is the thing that we continue over the next few weeks to celebrate. That is that Jesus, who was given up in death, who gave himself up in death as a consequence of our sinfulness, Jesus won. Jesus is not dead. Jesus is alive. And the fact that Jesus is alive, the fact that Jesus has overcome sin, death, and the devil means that this kind of evil, and it is surely evil, this kind of evil cannot win. This kind of evil is what's going to drive us in our community, in Incarnation Lutheran Church, to be with, to be beside, and to meet with people from the Chabad, people from the Orthodox Church next door, people from our entire interfaith community, so that they know that that which motivates us is not conditional acceptance based on denomination, but rather love based on the reality of God. With that, I'd like to invite you to join us in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not to temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Pastor Tim, could you say a benediction for us?
I will make one up, which is what I normally do at this stage. May the Lord strengthen you today. May the gospel message hold you. May the baptismal promise give you identity. And may this love that we proclaim flow through you, hold you, and also be the love that you share. In God's precious name I pray, and I send you out as God's children. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you all. Those of you who were able to join us, thank you for being with us.